In a recent video, I think it was a video I did about Jarrell Miller, I talked about the fact that being from the streets in this day and age doesn't really give you any kind of advantage in a boxing ring over someone who grew up in a lower middle class or middle class family necessarily. Because in 2018, and it's been like this for decades now, being from the streets in most inner cities means that you grow up in an area where there's a lot of gun crime, there's a lot of drug dealing, and in the case of the United Kingdom today, there's a lot of knife crime. Growing up in an environment where people are stabbing and shooting, how does that help you become good at using your fist to fight in the ring? I don't get it. Now, the only way it might help you is putting a boxing match in context, because if you're someone who has had a very sheltered upbringing, then having a fist fight with someone might be very, very dramatic to you. And stepping in the ring and fighting might be, you might take it far too seriously in the sense that you think it's far more dangerous and a far more dramatic situation than it actually is. Whereas if you've grown up in an environment where people are dying around you, people are getting shot, maybe you've been shot or you've been shot at or you've been in that life, a fist fight in a boxing ring isn't such a scary thought. All right. So there might be some advantage in that sense, but even then, not really, because most top professional fighters have had vast amateur experience. So if you grow up in like a lower middle class or middle class neighborhood and you've been boxing amateur from when you were 11, 12 years old, and you've been in international tournaments, you've boxed around the world, you've boxed in front of big crowds, you've boxed in the Olympics, there's nothing that can really happen in professional boxing which is going to overwhelm you because you've already experienced it in the amateur circuit, So I don't really see what advantage you can get in this day and age coming from an underprivileged background, coming from a rough environment in, most Western countries today. I don't see how that makes you any better at being a fist fighter. Back in the days, in decades gone by, maybe in America in, the 60s and the 70s, when there was still a lot of fair ones. People were shooting fair ones a lot back then, fist fighting. Now there was gun crime and stuff like that back then too, but nowhere near to the level that it got in, the mid to late 80s, the 90s, etc., where gun crime went crazy in the United States, in the ghettos and whatnot. Back in the days in America, even in somewhere like New York in, the 70s, the 60s, there was far more fist fighting, people shooting fair ones. And in that type of environment, it produced a lot of people who were good with their fists even before they stepped into a boxing gym. They've been in a tough environment where they've fought a lot of fist fights with people and gotten used to that. You understand? So coming from that type of situation, it might be an advantage over somebody who grew up in a middle class area. They've never had a street fight in their life, so on and so forth. That might be an advantage for you. That's one of the advantages that the gypsies today in the United Kingdom have, is they grew up with this bare knuckle fist fighting culture, and they still regularly have these bare knuckle fist fights in the UK. Even up until this day, regularly goes on with the gypsies in the UK. And that is an advantage that they do have over a lot of other UK fighters who, might come from backgrounds would have never had a street fight before. Although a lot of British fighters who are not gypsies have had plenty of street fights. I've had plenty of street fights. I had plenty of street fights back in the days. Did that really benefit me when I stepped in a boxing ring? I don't think it really did, to be honest, because the street fights were very, very different to what takes place in the boxing ring. Street fights are chaotic. You can headbutt people, elbow them, grab their clothes, pull their top over their face to cover their face and then hit them with uppercuts. get people in chokeholds. Like a street fight is anything. So it didn't really help me much when I stepped in a boxing ring. Because in a boxing ring, you're limited to just using your fists. So it might have helped me from a mental point of view when I first started boxing in terms of not being afraid. But even then, I grew up with people who would fight in the street, people who were involved in all kind of street crime, knife crime, gun crime, and had been to prison. And some of these guys who were tough guys on the road were scared to come to the boxing gym with me. Yeah. Guys who were genuinely tough on the road that didn't want to come in the boxing gym because their perception of what would go on in the boxing gym was different from reality. And also, they were out of their comfort zone in the boxing gym. Their comfort zone was the streets, where you can blindside a guy with a punch, where you can pull out a gun on a guy or a knife on a guy. Where if a guy is too big for you, you got your friend who can come up behind him and punch him in the back of the head, and then you get him from the front and beat his face in. You understand? I had friends who were doing all that kind of thing, but when I said come to the boxing gym, they didn't want to come. They were scared. And these are tough guys in the street. But then at the same time, there were other kids from nicer neighborhoods, lower middle class neighborhoods who had come in and they weren't scared to go in the gym. You understand what I'm telling you? From what I've seen and observed over my life, when it comes to a person being brave and having heart, it's more nature than it is nurture. An environment that you grow up in can influence your nature. It definitely can. But can it make you brave in the context of going in a boxing ring? I mean, I'm not sure about it. And here's the thing. You look at plenty of fighters out there, like, for example, Charles Martin. Right? He's from the hood. Did he show much bravery against Anthony Joshua, a guy who's not from the hood? Very little. You look at someone like Andre Dirrell. Andre Dirrell, very skilled fighter. But has he been known as a guy with a lot of heart? No, he hasn't. His heart has been questioned several times in his career. And he's somebody from a rough environment. Just because you come from the hood, the ghetto, the streets, it don't mean you're going to be the bravest guy in a boxing ring. And then you'll get another guy who's not from the streets who has loads of heart. Some people are just born with heart. You understand? And I'm going to give you some examples here of guys who were very brave, but they were not from the streets. Muhammad Ali. Yes, he grew up in the South, in the segregated South, but Ali grew up in a two-parent household, in a two-parent middle-class black household. Ali was not from the ghetto. So maybe seeing the segregation and seeing the racism that he saw fueled his fire to some extent. But poverty certainly didn't, because Ali didn't grow up in poverty. He didn't grow up in the ghetto. He didn't grow up with people getting shot and, black people shooting other black people and drug dealing all around him and crime and vice. And Ali didn't grow up in that environment. Many of the fighters that he fought did, but he didn't. He grew up in a middle-class neighborhood, in a middle-class household with two parents. Not no broken home or anything like that. He didn't come from a tragic family background. But yet Ali was one of the bravest fighters in the ring that you'll ever see. Marco Antonio Barrera. He comes from a well-to-do, upper middle class Mexican family, or certainly middle class at the least, Mexican family. Marco Antonio Barrera was studying to be a lawyer. In fact, he might have gone ahead and still got that qualification, that degree. But you go look at the background of Barrera. He comes from a family that have money. He grew up privileged compared to the other Mexican fighters. Yeah, he had money. He never grew up struggling. He didn't have to be a boxer. He could have gone on and, been a lawyer and all that kind of stuff and earned plenty of money doing that. But something within him compelled him to want to fight. He didn't have to, didn't need the money. comes from a good family, but he had a warrior spirit in him. He had that bravery in him naturally. It wasn't something that the environment had to put in him. It was already in him. You know, same with Chris Eubank Jr. Even though he has not lived up to his own hype and his dad's hype, he's shown courage in the ring. He's shown bravery. He lacks technical ability. He's not as confident as his dad was. But he's never, you know, gone in the ring and just run around and not wanting to get involved. He's never quit. And he's had hard times in the ring. I'm sure he's had to battle nerves and all that kind of stuff. But brave people feel nerves just like cowardly people do. It's like Costamado said, it's what you do with those nerves. Do you run or do you have the discipline to stay? Costamado called it the story of the hero and the coward. They both feel the same amount of fear, but the hero has the discipline to stay and do what needs to be done. Probably a bit deeper than that in all reality, but it is a nice way to describe it. But my point is, some people are just born braver than others. Yeah, some people become brave because of life experiences, but a lot of people are just born that way. They're just naturally brave. Now, some people will look at the fact that most boxers come from tough environments and tough upbringings and poor families. This is true. But most alcoholics come from poor environments too. Why is that? Okay, it's because in poor with relation to alcoholics, is because in poor communities, there is far more alcohol on sale. If you go into any poor community in London, you are going to see alcohol shops everywhere. You're going to see betting shops everywhere in the poor communities. But if you go to a rich neighborhood, there's hardly any shops selling alcohol. Very few of them. There are some there, but very few compared to a poor neighborhood. There are very few betting shops in a rich neighborhood, so on and so forth. So the temptation is not as present in a rich neighborhood. And with boxing, it's a similar story. In boxing, you know, in our poor neighborhoods, there are far more boxing gyms. There always has been historically, and there still is now. In poor neighborhoods, there are more boxing gyms. And in poor neighborhoods, people have got less opportunities to make money. So they're more likely to do a dangerous sport like boxing in order to try and get themselves out of poverty. In a middle class or rich neighborhood, they don't need to do boxing. It's not that there are not people there who don't, you know, who have the bravery to do boxing. There are plenty of brave people who grew up middle class. But from a logical point of view, they're thinking, well, I don't have to do this boxing stuff. It's very, very tough. It's difficult. And I could do it, but there are easier ways and safer ways to make a living. You know, ways where I won't get ripped off by managers and promoters and, you know, all that kind of stuff. And I won't get brain damage. I can go and do this job as a doctor or a lawyer or work in a family business or be a stockbroker or whatever the case may be. You know, and by the way, there are plenty of brave people who grew up middle class and rich. There are also plenty of vicious people who may be brave as well as being vicious. You know, not always. Sometimes they're cowardly and vicious, but sometimes they're brave and they're vicious and malevolent who grow up in middle class and rich backgrounds. Yeah, plenty of them there. They're not as visible because they go into white collar crime rather than blue collar crime. And white collar crime, you tend to get away with it far more because you got the connections than you do when you go into blue collar crime. So yeah, it's simply a situation where people who go into boxing are more likely to be those who don't have many opportunities and those who are desperate. And that is mainly going to be poor people. It doesn't necessarily mean that poor people are any braver than rich people. It just comes down to, you know, what choices they have. But the rich people or the middle class people who decide to take up boxing and they have this burning desire to fight, there's no reason why they can't be just as brave as the people who come from the ghettos. And I've just given you examples. As I say, Ali, Marco Antonio Barrera. Another example would be Teddy Atlas. Now, Teddy Atlas was never a great fighter, but Teddy Atlas grew up in a very affluent neighborhood on I think it was in Staten Island in New York. But he grew up in an affluent neighborhood, and his dad was a Jewish doctor who was very well off. But Teddy Atlas, for some reason or another, he rebelled against his middle-class upbringing, and he became a criminal. And he went to prison. I think he got sent to prison for armed robbery. And Teddy Atlas, if you ever look at him, he's got a massive scar down one side of his face. And he got that in a street fight. So this is a guy who grew up in a privileged middle-class family, but something in him wanted to be a fighter. You know? So it wasn't his environment that did that. He was just born like that. You know, more than likely he was born that way. And later in life, Teddy Atlas expressed his regret that he went down that route, because he feels like he basically brought shame to his family and disappointed his father. And he wanted to make up for his wild ways as a youngster before his dad died. That's, something Teddy Atlas always said was a wish of his, that he could redeem himself in the eyes of his father, because he felt like he probably disappointed his dad, because his dad had worked hard and become a successful man. Why would his son go off and be a delinquent in them circumstances? But as I say, some people want to fight. It don't matter how they're raised. They just want to fight, and they're compelled. So, even fighters today, I don't really know much about the upbringing of Sean Porter. And I think he's from Ohio, right? I don't know much about his upbringing. I know his dad was in the streets a little bit, but Sean Porter is, as far as I know, a good Christian boy. He's never been involved in any kind of crime or anything like that. He's had a pretty good upbringing as far as I'm aware, Sean Porter, but yet he's a brave fighter. He doesn't need to come from the streets. He don't need to have been to prison or been through all of this stuff to be brave in the ring. He's been fighting people in the ring from when he was a little boy. You understand? The best thing to prepare you for combat in a boxing ring is combat in a boxing ring. It's not shootouts in the street. It's not going to jail. It's not knife fights. It's not gang fights. It's not drug dealing. That is not what's going to best prepare you for combat in a boxing ring. You understand what I'm telling you? So that is, I think, a little bit of a myth that has existed in boxing for a long time because of the association of poverty and boxing. People coming from impoverished backgrounds constitute the majority of boxers, and therefore people think, well, you have to be from an impoverished background to be a successful boxer. But actually, no, you don't. It's only that way because people from well-to-do families have got more options, better options in most cases. So why not take the better option? So many impoverished people, especially back in the days in the 50s and 60s and stuff like that. These are people who, if they had a viable alternative to boxing to make money, they would have gone the viable alternative route. They wouldn't have taken up boxing. They only took up boxing because they saw it as the only way. Sugar Ray Robinson, one of, and in some people's eyes, in many people's eyes, the greatest fighter of all time, he said that he hated boxing. He didn't like boxing. He thought it was a barbaric sport. And he was a barbaric fighter. But I guess that was his method of survival, is kill or be killed. And, I don't even use that in the metaphorical sense, especially back then during Sugar Ray Robinson's time, because he did kill a man in the ring. And fatalities in boxing rings were far more common back then than they are today. So when you're in that type of situation where you could be killed, sometimes the best form of defense is attack, and to become 10 times more vicious than the man you're in the ring with in order to ensure your own survival. But that don't mean that you like being in there. That don't mean that you like fighting necessarily. Some people did. But a lot of the fighters took that up as a profession because there was no other way out. And some people, as I say, who are from middle class backgrounds, they take it up, even when there is plenty of other routes they could go, but they have so much of a warrior spirit, so much of a fighting instinct, that nobody can tell them nothing. Nobody can tell them this is stupid. You can be a doctor, you can be a lawyer, you can go into family business. They won't listen to nobody. They want to fight, and that's that. They're compelled. They stay awake at night, grinding their teeth, wanting to fight. And I say, let them fight. I'm not going to hold it against somebody because they come from a privileged background. That's what I've learned. Because I grew up with that kind of arrogance. I grew up in a tough neighborhood, and I used to think them kind of things. I used to think that if you're not also from a tough neighborhood, you can't be a top fighter. I mean, even Lennox Lewis, right? Lennox Lewis, when he lived in the UK till about the age of 12, he grew up in West Ham. West Ham, I guess, was relatively tough back then, but it wasn't anything crazy. And he never really experienced anything too crazy when he grew up in West Ham. Then he moved to Canada, and he lived in a leafy, quiet suburb in Canada. And that's really where he learned to fight. You know what I mean? Like, that wasn't a tough environment, but yet he went on to become one of the greatest heavyweights of all time. Klitschko didn't come from no ghetto. I know he grew up in a very strict communist country where there was a lot of regiment, and his dad was some kind of sergeant or something like that. But to my knowledge, he grew up in a pretty well-to-do family. So again, money and how impoverished you are doesn't necessarily mean that you can or cannot fight, or you can or cannot display courage. A lot of this stuff is just innate, and it's in people, and you're born with it, you have it or you don't. Because I've met plenty of people, trust me, who are from the streets, who are from rough backgrounds, and they really don't have no heart. Yeah. When they're in the streets and they've got the advantage of having their friends around them and having weapons and having the advantage of, attacking you from behind or from the side or catching you off guard, yeah, that's when they'll put in work. But get that person to actually put up their fists and fight somebody one-on-one who actually knows how to fight. In that kind of situation, a lot of them are cowards and they don't want to do it. Facts. And anyone who's from a rough environment, who's from a ghetto or tough neighbor, they'll know what I'm saying is true too, because they've seen it themselves. A lot of these guys who put in work in the street, they can't fight one-on-one. They can't shoot the fair one. And when they do shoot the fair one, some of them wanted to quit and bail out, tap out, do whatever they have to do, come up with excuses as to why they can't fight on. They ain't brave like that. They're out of their comfort zone. Their comfort zone is anything goes. Use weapons, use surprise attacks, use, free people on one person to beat them up, and use guns and knives. That's their comfort zone. And to someone who's never been in that type of environment, they might be cowards in that situation. That guy who's scared to fight one-on-one, he feels comfortable in a gun shootout because he's familiar with it. He feels like he's in control in that situation, more so than he would be fighting one-on-one with his fists. But someone who's not from that kind of environment, even if they've got a gun, they're legging it. They're not trying to get involved. Now, some people who grew up in middle-class backgrounds, particularly in America, they won't run if there's a gunfight. All right? Because, a lot of Americans, especially down in the South, they love their guns. So they might be middle-class people, but they go to the firing range all the time. They've had weapons training and stuff like that. They fancy themselves as shooters and whatever. And when some armed robbery is going on, they might step in and try to be a hero and take somebody out. That does go on, obviously. But generally, it's about whatever you're comfortable with, And, you could be a middle-class kid who's been boxing since you were 8. You're comfortable in the ring. You've boxed all around the world with your country in front of big crowds. So you go in there as a professional and fight for a world title against somebody who's from the roughest ghetto, and you're not scared. You're not showing no fear. You're not worried. And in fact, he might be the one who don't really have all that heart. I mean, Zab Judah, I don't want to say Zab Judah was ever a cowardly fighter, but Zab Judah had a lot of punk in him. And Zab Judah's from Brownsville. All right, that used to be, back in the days, one of the very toughest parts of New York. And certainly when Zab Judah grew up, Brownsville was an absolute hellhole back then. It's nowhere near as bad now, but when Judah grew up in, I want to say the 80s through the 90s, yeah, Brownsville was a hellhole back then. But is Zab Judah the bravest fight you've ever seen? Zab Judah was the kind of guy who, when things were getting on top for him, he would try and cheat. That's what I mean by punk. Yeah? But he wouldn't just get his head down, grit his teeth, and fight through adversity. Nah. When Zab Judah was finding himself in a spot of difficulty, he would try and blame somebody or try and cheat. You know? That's what I mean by he had a lot of punk in him. So, anyway, I'm going to leave that there and give you guys something to contemplate if you haven't thought about this subject before. But I brought it up a few weeks ago, whenever it was, in the Jerome Miller video, because Miller is still stuck in that mindset of thinking, okay, if you ain't from the hood, then you're a punk. You can't fight. He still seems to be stuck in that mindset, you know, but I learned that a long time ago, you know, coming from the hood myself, a rough environment. When I would go to the gym, there would be kids from all over, from different environments, from different neighborhoods. And I quickly found out, and particularly when a lot of the gang members from my area were coming in the gym, most of these guys can't fight. Most of the top gang members, a lot of the top gang members who would come into the gyms that I was at, they come in the gym one time, acting like they're tough, spar, get bashed up in sparring, and then leave the gym and never come back. I saw that happen loads of times with these road guys who came in. Guys who were shooters and all kinds of stuff, come in the gym, thinking they're tough, have one sparring session, can't even last a round, and they never come back to the gym. And no one's supposed to talk about it. Shh. Name no names. So, but then I saw other kids from kind of middle class backgrounds come in and had loads of heart, you know? Anyway, I'm going to leave it there. Drop your comments below. It's happening. I'm out.